The milk spread across the dusty wooden porch like a white river of desperation, pooling between the weathered boards and dripping onto the sun-baked earth below. And Grace Patterson stood frozen above it, her fingers still gripping the handle of the empty tin pail as tears carved clean tracks down her dirt-smudged cheeks. It was the summer of 1878 in Keeler, California, a mining town clinging to life on the edge of the Owning Valley, where every drop of water counted and every ounce of sustenance meant the difference between survival and surrender. Grace had walked 3 miles to the Henderson farm that morning, traded the last of her dried herbs for that precious gallon of milk. And now it was gone, all of it, wasted because her trembling hands had fumbled at her own doorstep. She sank to her knees, her worn calico dress pooling around her, and pressed her palm against the wet boards as if she could somehow gather it back, reclaim what was lost. The sun beat down mercilessly, already beginning to sour what remained in the cracks. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. This was not just about milk. This was about the 5th month since her father had died in the mines, the 3rd month since her mother had followed him to the grave from grief and fever, the 2nd month since her older brother had headed east with empty promises to send money, and the first morning she had realized she was completely and utterly alone at 19 years old with nothing but a dilapidated cabin and a garden struggling to survive in the harsh valley soil. The sound of hoofbeats registered somewhere in her consciousness, but she did not look up. Shame burned hotter than the California sun. Let whoever it was ride past. Let them see her on her knees weeping over spilled milk like a child. She had nothing left to lose, not her pride, not her dignity, certainly not the milk that was now feeding the parched earth instead of her empty stomach. "Madam," the voice was deep, gentle, and so close that Grace startled, her head snapping up. The man sat astride a dappled gray horse, his broad-brimmed hat shading a face that was all hard angles and sun-weathered skin. But his eyes were kind, a surprising warm brown that studied her with concern rather than judgment. He could not have been much older than her, perhaps 23 or 24, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a strong jaw shadowed with several days' worth of stubble. "I am fine," Grace managed, her voice hoarse. She scrambled to her feet, swiping at her tears with the back of her hand. "Please, just go about your business." The man dismounted with easy grace, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with the lean build of someone who spent his days working rather than sitting. His clothes were dusty from travel, his leather vest worn but well-maintained, and a pair of revolvers sat holstered at his hips with the casual confidence of someone who knew how to use them. "Looks like you have had some trouble," he said, nodding toward the spilled milk. His voice carried a hint of something Eastern, not quite refined but educated beyond what she would have expected from a drifting cowboy. "It was clumsy of me," Grace said stiffly, clutching the empty pail against her chest like a shield. "I will manage." "I am sure you will," he agreed, but he did not mount his horse again. Instead, he looked at her cabin, taking in the sagging roof, the garden with its struggling plants, the general air of barely contained collapse. His gaze returned to her face, and something shifted in his expression. "You live here alone," Grace lifted her chin. "That is none of your concern, sir. You are right, it is not." He extended his hand. "Grant Lawson. I just signed on at the Running J Ranch about 5 miles west. I was riding through to get familiar with the area." She hesitated, then took his hand briefly. His palm was calloused, his grip gentle. "Grace Patterson. Miss Patterson." He tipped his hat, and something about the gesture, the simple courtesy of it, made her throat tighten with fresh tears she refused to shed. "That milk you spilled. Was it your last?" The directness of the question should have offended her, but somehow it did not. Perhaps because she was too tired for pretense, or perhaps because those brown eyes held nothing but genuine concern. "Yes," she admitted quietly. Grant nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already suspected. He looked down the road, then back at her, and she saw him making some kind of decision behind those thoughtful eyes. "Miss Patterson, I have a proposition for you," he said. "And I will ask you to hear me out before you refuse. I am not interested in charity, Mr. Lawson. Good, because I am not offering any." He hooked his thumbs in his belt, a gesture that seemed more about giving himself time to think than any sort of posturing. "What I am offering is a solution to a problem. You need milk. More than that, you need a steady supply of it if I am reading this situation correctly. I get paid in 2 days, and I happen to know that old man Henderson has been trying to sell one of his milk cows because he has got too many and not enough grazing land. Now, I could buy that cow for you, and you could pay me back by providing fresh milk and butter to the ranch house. The running jay has 20 hands, and they are all tired of condensed milk in their coffee. What do you say?" Grace stared at him, her mind struggling to process the offer. "You want to buy me a cow?" "I want to make a business arrangement," he corrected. "You get a steady source of milk and income. The ranch gets fresh dairy. I get the satisfaction of knowing I helped someone while also improving my living conditions. Seems like everybody wins. You do not even know me." "True enough," Grant acknowledged. "But I know desperation when I see it, and I know that sometimes people just need a hand up, not a handout. My own family lost everything in the panic of '73. We were living in Chicago, my father had a business, and then suddenly we had nothing. A stranger gave him a loan to head west, no collateral, just faith. My father spent the rest of his life paying that kindness forward. I figure I can do the same." There was something in the way he spoke, a quiet conviction that made her want to believe him. But Grace had learned the hard way that nothing came without strings. "What do you really want, Mr. Lawson?" she asked, meeting his eyes directly. "Because in my experience, men do not offer to buy expensive livestock for women they just met without expecting something in return." A flash of respect crossed his face. "That is fair. You are right to be suspicious. The truth is, I do not want anything beyond what I said. But if you need more assurance, we can draw up a contract. You pay me back for the cow through milk and butter deliveries, at a rate we both agree is fair. Everything in writing, legal and proper. And Miss Patterson." He took a step closer, and she caught the scent of leather and sage. "If I wanted something improper, I would not announce my place of employment and make myself so easy to track down and hold accountable." The logic of that struck her, and for the first time since the milk had spilled, Grace felt something other than despair. She felt the faint, fragile stirring of hope. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. Grant was silent for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of old sorrow. "Because 3 years ago my sister stood in almost the exact same spot you are now, crying over something broken, certain the world was ending with no one to help, and I was not there. I was trying to make money in the silver mines in Nevada, and by the time I got the letter, by the time I made it home, she was gone. Fever took her. Maybe if she had eaten better, if she had not been so worn down, she would have had the strength to fight it." He cleared his throat, looking away. "I cannot help Mary anymore, but I can help you." The raw honesty of it pierced through all her defenses. Grace found herself nodding before she had fully made the decision. "All right," she said, "but I insist on a contract, and I insist on paying you back every penny." For the first time, Grant smiled, and it transformed his entire face, softening the hard lines and reaching those kind eyes. "I would expect nothing less, Miss Patterson." They shook hands again, and this time Grace let her grip linger a moment longer, feeling the strange sense that her life had just shifted direction in a way she could not yet comprehend. 2 days later, true to his word, Grant Lawson rode up to her cabin leading a beautiful Jersey cow with a gentle disposition and a heavy udder. Grace stood in her yard, having spent the past 48 hours cleaning out the small barn, mending fences with materials scavenged from the surrounding area, and trying not to let herself believe this was actually happening. "Miss Patterson," Grant greeted, tipping his hat. "Meet Daisy. Mr. Henderson assures me she is the sweetest-tempered cow in the valley and a reliable milker." Grace approached slowly, extending her hand to let the cow sniff her. Daisy huffed warm breath against her palm, and Grace felt tears prick her eyes again, but these were different. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of a burden lifted. "She is perfect," Grace whispered. "Henderson threw in a bag of feed to get her started, and he said your pasture should be adequate as long as you supplement with hay through the winter." Grant dismounted, pulling a folded paper from his saddlebag. "I took the liberty of drawing up a contract. My education might have ended at 14, but my father made sure I could read and write well enough. I figured you would want to see everything in ink." They sat on her porch steps, and Grace read through the agreement carefully. It was straightforward and fair, perhaps more than fair. She would provide 3 gallons of milk and 1 pound of butter to the Running J Ranch twice weekly. At the market rate, she would have the cow paid off in 18 months with no interest. "This is more than generous, Mr. Lawson," she said, looking up from the paper. "Grant," he corrected. "And it is just fair, Miss Patterson. Then you should call me Grace." He smiled again, that transformative expression that made her stomach do a strange little flip. "Grace it is." She signed the contract with the pen and ink he provided, her signature neat despite her trembling hand. When she handed it back, their fingers brushed, and Grace felt a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with business arrangements. "I will come by in 3 days for the first delivery," Grant said, standing and tucking the contract away. "That should give you time to get Daisy settled and start your production. If you need anything at all, the Running J is an easy ride. Anyone there can find me." "Thank you," Grace said, and the words felt inadequate for the magnitude of what he had done. "Truly, I do not know how to properly express my gratitude." "No gratitude needed. This is business, remember." But his eyes were warm, and Grace suspected they both knew it was more than that. After he left, Grace spent the rest of the day settling Daisy into the barn, milking her for the first time and marveling at the rich, creamy liquid that filled her pail. She drank a cup fresh, the taste sweeter than she remembered, then set about making butter with the cream, her hands falling into the rhythmic work her mother had taught her years ago. That night, for the first time in months, she went to bed with a full stomach, and something she had almost forgotten: hope for tomorrow. The next 3 days passed in a flurry of activity. Grace threw herself into work, tending Daisy, working her garden with renewed energy, and preparing for her first delivery to the Running J. She borrowed her neighbor's wagon, a kind widow named Mrs. Chen, who asked no questions but whose knowing smile suggested she had heard about the handsome cowboy and his generous gesture. When Grace arrived at the Running J Ranch on the appointed day, she was overwhelmed by the size of the operation. The main house was a sprawling structure of wood and stone, surrounded by bunkhouses, barns, corrals filled with horses and cattle, and a general sense of organized chaos. Cowboys moved with purpose, their voices carrying on the hot afternoon air, and Grace felt suddenly small and out of place. "Can I help you, miss?" A grizzled older man approached, his weathered face friendly beneath his hat, I am Grace Patterson. I have a delivery for the ranch. Milk and butter. Mr. Lawson arranged it. The man's face lit up. Oh, you are the milk lady. Grant told us about you. Come on, the cook will be mighty pleased. We have been making do with that tinned stuff for too long. Name is Pete, by the way, foreman of this outfit. Pete helped her unload the heavy jugs and butter crocks, keeping up a steady stream of friendly chatter that put her at ease. The cook, a rotund man with a thick German accent named Klaus, practically danced with joy when he saw the fresh dairy. This is wonderful, fresh butter, real milk. You are an angel, Miss Patterson, an absolute angel. Grace could not help but laugh at his enthusiasm. I am glad to provide it. I will be back in 3 days with another delivery. You tell that Grant he done good, Klaus said, winking. Real good. Grace felt her cheeks warm, but before she could respond, a familiar voice spoke behind her. Telling tales about me, Klaus. She turned to find Grant striding across the yard, his face breaking into that smile when he saw her. He was even dustier than the first time they had met, his shirt stained with sweat and dirt, but somehow he still made her pulse quicken. Only the truth, Klaus declared. You brought us an angel. I brought you a business arrangement, Grant corrected, but his eyes never left Grace. How is Daisy settling in? Wonderfully. She is a dream. Grace was acutely aware of the interested looks from the cowboys who were finding excuses to linger nearby. The milk is flowing well and she seems content. Good. I am glad. Grant glanced at the westering sun. You heading back now? Yes, I should get the wagon back to Mrs. Chen before dark. Mind if I ride along? I wanted to check on Daisy myself, make sure everything is working out. My responsibility as the investor, you understand. It was a thin excuse and they both knew it, but Grace found herself nodding. I would welcome the company. The ride back to her cabin was filled with easy conversation. Grant told her about his work at the ranch, his plans to save money and eventually buy his own land. Grace found herself opening up about her parents, her absent brother, her struggles to maintain the property alone. It should have felt too intimate, too soon, but somehow with Grant it felt natural, as if they had known each other far longer than a handful of days. Your brother, Grant said carefully as her cabin came into view. Does he know how dire things got? Grace's jaw tightened. I wrote him. 3 times. He sent one letter back saying he was working on getting established, that he would send money soon. That was 2 months ago. Some people run from responsibility, Grant observed, and some people face it head-on. You are the second kind, Grace. That takes strength. No one had acknowledged her struggle like that, validated it, and Grace felt her throat tighten with emotion. Some days I do not feel very strong. Strength is not about never breaking. It is about putting yourself back together after you do. He pulled his horse to a stop as they reached her cabin. Like you did after spilling that milk, you could have given up right there. Instead, you let someone help you, and now look, you are building something. Grant dismounted and helped her down from the wagon, his hands strong and steady at her waist. For a moment they stood close, and Grace caught herself noticing the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, the way his hair curled slightly at his temple, the small scar on his chin. I should check on Daisy, he said, his voice slightly rougher than before. They walked to the barn together, and Grant did indeed inspect the cow thoroughly, nodding with approval at the clean conditions and the improvements Grace had made to the structure. You have done well here, he said. Really well. I am motivated, Grace said with a small smile. I owe a stubborn cowboy money. The most stubborn, he agreed, grinning. Then his expression grew more serious. Grace, I want you to know if you ever need anything, not just business-related, you can come to me or send word. I meant what I said about helping. I know you did. She met his eyes. And that means more than you might realize. As the sun set and Grant prepared to leave, Grace found herself reluctant to see him go. Over the following weeks, as she made her regular deliveries to the running J, that reluctance only grew. Grant always seemed to be there when she arrived, ready to help her unload, to share a cup of coffee, to walk with her and talk about everything and nothing. The other ranch hands noticed, of course. Pete took to giving Grant knowing looks, and Klaus started packing extra food for Grace to take home. If the gossip bothered Grant, he never showed it. He remained unfailingly respectful, never presuming anything beyond friendship, but the growing connection between them was undeniable. One evening in early September, as Grace was preparing to leave after a delivery, Grant stopped her with a hesitant expression. "Grace, there is a dance in town this Saturday, the Harvest Social. I was wondering if you might allow me to escort you." Her heart jumped. "As in a courting situation?" "Yes," he said simply. "As in a courting situation. I know we started as business partners, but I think we both know it has become more than that, at least for me. If I am reading this wrong, please tell me, but I would like the chance to properly court you, Grace Patterson." Grace thought about propriety, about the short time they had known each other, about all the sensible reasons she should say no. Then she thought about Grant's kindness, his steadiness, the way her days felt brighter when she knew she would see him, and how for the first time since her parents died, she did not feel completely alone. "I would like that very much," she said. The smile that spread across Grant's face was worth every risk her heart was taking. The Harvest Social was held in Keeler's largest barn, decorated with autumn leaves and lit by dozens of lanterns. Grace wore her mother's best dress, a deep blue cotton that she had carefully altered to fit, and felt beautiful for the first time in longer than she could remember. Grant called for her in a borrowed buggy, looking devastatingly handsome in clean clothes, his hair neatly combed, his jaw freshly shaved. The look in his eyes when he saw her made Grace's breath catch. "You are stunning," he said, and the reverence in his voice made it clear he meant every word. The dance was a revelation. Grace had not socialized much since her parents' deaths, too consumed with survival to think about community. But with Grant at her side, introducing her to people, dancing with her through every song, she felt welcomed back into the life of the town. People who had looked at her with pity now looked at her with respect, seeing not the tragic orphan girl but a capable young woman building a business and capturing the attention of one of the most eligible bachelors in the valley. "You are quite the dancer," Grace said as Grant spun her through a lively reel, his hand warm and sure at her waist. "My mother insisted all her children learn," he replied. "She said it was the mark of civilization, even on the frontier." "Tell me about her," Grace invited. "Your family." "You have mentioned them, but never in detail." The music slowed and they moved into a waltz closer now, Grant's voice low enough that only she could hear. "My mother was a force of nature. Smart as a whip, tough as nails, but with a heart that could embrace the whole world. She taught school back in Chicago, met my father when he came to fix the schoolhouse roof. They were married 6 months later, and she always said she knew after their first conversation that he was the one." Grant's expression grew distant. "She died in '75. The consumption. My father followed her a year later. I think he just could not bear to be without her." "And your sister?" "Mary." Mary was the baby, 10 years younger than me, bright and funny and so full of life. When our parents died, she was only 15. I should have stayed, should have taken care of her, but I was young and stupid and thought I could make quick money in the mines and send for her. By the time I realized how wrong I was, it was too late." Grace squeezed his hand. "You cannot carry that guilt forever, Grant." "I know. Or at least I am learning." He met her eyes. Meeting you, helping you, it has helped me forgive myself a little, made me feel like maybe Mary would understand, would approve. I think she would more than approve, Grace said softly. I think she would be proud of the man her brother became. Grant pulled her infinitesimally closer, technically improper but feeling exactly right. They danced in silence for a while, and Grace felt the last of her reservations melting away. This was not just attraction or gratitude or convenience. This was something real, something worth exploring, something that felt like it could be the beginning of forever. As autumn progressed into winter, Grant and Grace's courtship deepened. He came to her cabin whenever his work allowed, helping her prepare for the cold months, chopping wood until she had a supply that would last through spring, mending her roof, reinforcing her barn. She fed him supper afterward, and they would sit by her fire talking until the late hours, learning each other's stories, dreams, fears, and hopes. The first time Grant kissed her, it was late November, snow just beginning to fall in soft flakes that dusted the valley in white. They were standing in her barn after checking on Daisy, and he had just finished nailing up the last patch to keep out the winter wind. Grace had been holding the lantern, and when he turned to her, covered in sawdust and so handsome it made her ache, she could not stop herself from reaching up to brush a wood shaving from his hair. Grant caught her hand, pressed a kiss to her palm, and then slowly giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning, and when Grace leaned into it, deepening it, she felt Grant's arms come around her, strong and sure. She dropped the lantern to the hay-covered floor and wrapped her arms around his neck, and for several perfect moments, nothing existed but the two of them and the promise of something beautiful. "I love you," Grant whispered against her lips. "I've been trying not to say it, trying to be patient and proper, but Grace, I love you. I think I have since the moment I saw you crying on that porch." "I love you too," Grace breathed, the words feeling like coming home. "So much it terrifies me." "Love is terrifying," he agreed, resting his forehead against hers. "But it is also the only thing worth being terrified for." They stood in the barn, holding each other as the snow fell outside, and Grace felt the last piece of her broken heart slot back into place. That winter was hard, as winters in the Owning Valley always were, but Grace faced it with Grant at her side and found it bearable. More than bearable, she found it beautiful. There was something magical about the snow-covered landscape, the cozy evenings by the fire, the way Grant would ride over even in the worst weather just to make sure she was safe and warm. On Christmas Eve, Grant presented her with a small wrapped package. Inside was a delicate silver locket, and when she opened it, she found a photograph of Grant on one side and an empty space on the other. "That side is for you," he said quietly, "if you want it to be." "Grace, I know we have not been courting long by conventional standards, but nothing about our relationship has been conventional from the start. I want to marry you. I want to build a life with you. I want to fill that cabin with children and laughter and love. I am not asking yet because I want to do this right, but I am telling you my intentions. I am telling you that when spring comes, I am going to ask you properly, and I hope with everything in me that you will say yes." Grace looked at the locket, then at Grant's earnest face and felt joy swell in her chest so powerfully she thought she might burst. "You are asking me to wait until spring," she said, a smile playing at her lips. "That seems unnecessary, do you not think?" Grant's eyes widened. "Grace, I do not want you to feel rushed. I do not feel rushed. I feel certain." She took his hand, pressed it over her heart so he could feel how it raced. "Grant Lawson, I do not need pretty words or a fancy proposal, I just need you. So yes, I will marry you whenever you ask, however you ask, but preferably soon because I am tired of you leaving at the end of every evening." He laughed, the sound pure and joyful, and swept her into his arms, spinning her around the small cabin until they were both dizzy and laughing. "You are sure?" he asked when he set her down. "You are absolutely sure?" "I have never been more sure of anything," Grace said, and kissed him to prove it. They were married in January of 1879 in the same barn where the harvest social had been held, with half the town in attendance. Grace wore a new dress that Mrs. Chen had helped her sew, white muslin with blue ribbons, and carried a bouquet of dried flowers saved from her summer garden. Grant wore his best suit, borrowed from Pete, who was close enough in size, and when he saw Grace walking toward him, his eyes filled with tears that he did not bother to hide. The ceremony was simple, conducted by the traveling preacher who made his rounds through the valley towns, but the vows they spoke were heartfelt and genuine. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife and Grant kissed her, the assembled crowd erupted in cheers and applause. The celebration lasted well into the night, with food and music and dancing. Klaus had outdone himself with the wedding feast, and Pete gave a rambling, half-drunken toast that somehow perfectly captured the miracle of two broken people finding each other and becoming whole. As the evening wound down and they prepared to head back to what was now their cabin, the owner of the running J, a silver-haired man named Mr. Jennings, pulled Grant aside. Grace watched from a distance, curious, and saw Grant's expression shift from surprise to shock to something like awe. "What was that about?" she asked as they finally climbed into the buggy for the ride home. "Mr. Jennings offered me a job, not just a hand position, but as assistant foreman. Pete is getting older, wants to start stepping back, and Jennings says he has been impressed with my work. It comes with better pay, a house on the property, and the possibility of buying into the ranch eventually as a partner." Grant looked at her, his eyes bright in the moonlight. "Grace, this could be our future, real security, a real home." "We already have a home," Grace said, but she was smiling. "But a bigger home with a steady income and a future. That sounds perfect." "There is one complication," Grant said slowly. "The house is 5 miles from your cabin. You would have to leave it behind, the place where you grew up." Grace looked back toward Keeler, thinking about her little cabin with its memories both painful and precious. Then she looked at Grant, at her husband, at the man who had saved her with a simple act of kindness and ended up becoming her entire world. "Home is not a place," she said. "It is wherever you are. The cabin is just wood and nails. Our life together, that is what matters." Grant kissed her then, gentle and loving, and Grace knew she had spoken the absolute truth. They spent their wedding night in Grace's cabin, making love for the first time with the tenderness and passion of two people who had chosen each other completely. Afterward, lying in Grant's arms, Grace traced the scar on his chin and listened to his heartbeat and felt more content than she had ever imagined possible. "Tell me something," she murmured. "That first day when you saw me crying over the milk, did you have any idea this would happen?" Grant was quiet for a moment, his fingers combing gently through her hair. "I knew something had shifted in me. I knew I could not just ride away and forget you. Did I know I would fall completely in love and marry you within 6 months? No. But I knew you were important. I knew you were going to change my life." "You changed mine," Grace said. "You saved it." "We saved each other," Grant corrected and kissed the top of her head. "That is what love does, I think. It saves us from ourselves, from our loneliness, from thinking we have to carry everything alone." Grace fell asleep that night wrapped in warmth and love, and did not dream of loss, but of the future stretching bright and hopeful before them. The transition to the running J was smoother than Grace had anticipated. Grant and several of the hands helped move her belongings, and Grant insisted on bringing Daisy with them, installing her in the ranch's dairy barn. "She is your cow," he said firmly when Grace protested that the ranch had their own dairy operation. "You earned her, you paid her off in full last month, and she is coming with us." The house that came with Grant's new position was small but well built, with 2 bedrooms, a real kitchen, and even glass windows. Grace spent her first week there cleaning and arranging, making it their home, while Grant threw himself into his new responsibilities. His promotion came with respect from the other hands. Grant had always been well liked, but now he was also their leader, responsible for organizing work details, managing disputes, and serving as the bridge between the workers and Mr. Jennings. He took to the role naturally, his fairness and work ethic inspiring loyalty. Grace continued her milk and butter deliveries, but now she also helped Klaus in the kitchen during busy seasons, and she started a substantial vegetable garden on a plot Mr. Jennings set aside for her. The ranch became not just Grant's workplace but their community, and Grace found herself welcomed into the rough and tumble family of cowboys, cooks, and cattlemen. Spring arrived with wildflowers carpeting the valley, and with it came news that made Grace's heart both leap and ache. A letter arrived from her brother Thomas, full of apologies and explanations. He had found work in San Francisco, had gotten married, and had been sending money for months, only to have the letters returned marked addressee unknown. He begged Grace to write back, to let him know she was all right, to forgive him for abandoning her. "What do you want to do?" Grant asked, reading over her shoulder. Grace stared at the letter, emotions warring inside her. Anger at being left alone, understanding that Thomas had been young and grieving too, resentment at the month she had suffered, relief that he had not simply forgotten her. "I want to write back," she decided. "I want to tell him I am well, that I am married, that I am happy. I want to forgive him, because holding on to anger just poisons my own joy. But I also want him to know that I managed without him, that I found my own way." "That seems fair," Grant said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "You are a better person than most, Grace Lawson." She leaned back against him, savoring the sound of her married name. "I have a lot to be grateful for. It makes forgiveness easier." The response she wrote was honest but kind, and when Thomas's reply came a month later, full of gratitude and joy at her happiness, Grace felt a weight she had not known she was carrying finally lift. Her brother was alive, was well, and while they might never be as close as they once were, the possibility of reconciliation existed. That summer, Grace discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but when the doctor in Keeler confirmed it, she felt a joy so profound it brought tears to her eyes. That evening, when Grant came home dusty and tired from a long day moving cattle, she met him at the door with the news. For a moment he just stared at her, and then he let out a whoop of pure happiness, swept her into his arms, and spun her around just as he had on the night she agreed to marry him. "We are going to have a baby," he kept repeating, as if testing the words. "Grace, we are going to be parents." "Are you happy?" she asked, though his reaction made the answer obvious. "Happy does not begin to cover it," he said, his hands moving to her still flat stomach with reverent gentleness. "Terrified, yes. Overwhelmed, definitely. But happy, Grace, I am so happy I could burst." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and as Grace's belly grew, so did Grant's protectiveness. He insisted she stop heavy work, took over all the chores she had been doing, and hovered so attentively that she finally had to sit him down and remind him that women had been having babies since the beginning of time. "Yes, but they were not having my baby," he countered. "They were not you, carrying the most precious thing in my world besides yourself." It was hard to argue with that, so Grace accepted his care with as much grace as she could muster, though she still insisted on maintaining her garden and helping Klaus with light kitchen work. In late February of 1880, on a cold, clear night with stars brilliant overhead, Grace went into labor. Grant rode like a madman to fetch the midwife, Mrs. Chen, who had delivered half the babies in the valley, and then paced the house like a caged animal while Grace labored. The birth was long and difficult, as first births often were, and there were moments when Grant, hearing Grace's cries through the closed bedroom door, felt terror like he had never known. But Mrs. Chen was experienced and calm, and just as dawn was breaking over the Owning Valley, a baby's cry split the air. Grant burst into the bedroom to find Grace exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle to her chest. "A boy," she said, her voice hoarse but full of wonder. "Grant, we have a son." He approached slowly, almost afraid to breathe, and looked down at the tiny red face peeking from the blanket. His son. His and Grace's son. "He is perfect," Grant whispered, one finger gently touching the baby's tiny hand. The infant's fingers immediately curled around his, and Grant felt his heart expand in a way he had not known was possible. "What should we name him?" Grace asked. They had discussed names, of course, but now, looking at the reality of their child, the names they had chosen seemed inadequate. Then Grant thought of his father, the man who had taught him about integrity and hard work and kindness. "Michael," he said, "after my father. Michael Thomas for your brother too." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "It is perfect." Michael Lawson was a healthy, hearty baby who quickly became the darling of the entire Running Jay Ranch. Cowboys who could face down angry bulls turned to mush around him, and Klaus made the most elaborate baby foods Grace had ever seen. Pete carved wooden toys with surprising delicacy, and even Mr. Jennings, usually gruff and business-focused, could be found making ridiculous faces trying to elicit a smile from the baby. Grace and Grant fell into the exhausting, exhilarating rhythm of new parenthood, taking turns with night feedings, marveling over every milestone, and somehow falling even more in love with each other as they watched each other become parents. One night when Michael was 3 months old and finally sleeping through the night, Grace and Grant sat on their porch, wrapped in a shared blanket, watching the stars. "You ever think about that day?" Grace asked. "When you found me crying over spilled milk?" "All the time," Grant admitted. "I think about how close I came to just riding past. I almost did, you know. I told myself it was not my business, that I should keep moving." "What changed your mind?" "You reminded me of Mary. The way you were sitting there, so defeated, trying to gather it back up, and I just could not do it. Could not leave someone in pain when I had the ability to help." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Best decision I ever made." "Best accident I ever had," Grace countered, and they both laughed softly, careful not to wake the baby sleeping inside. "It was not an accident," Grant said. "Maybe in the moment it seemed like one, but I think it was fate. The universe putting you in the exact right place at the exact right time for me to find you." "You do not believe in fate," Grace teased. Grant was practical, logical, grounded in the real world. "I did not," he corrected. "But how else do you explain this? Two broken people, brought together by milk and a cow, ending up with everything we never knew we needed." Grace had to concede the point. Their story was too perfect, too improbable to be mere chance. As Michael grew from a baby to a toddler, Grace and Grant's lives settled into a comfortable pattern. Grant continued to excel in his position, and when Pete retired in 1882, Grant was promoted to full foreman with a substantial raise and a percentage of the ranch's profits. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable, secure in a way Grace had never dreamed possible during those dark months after her parents' deaths. In the spring of 1883, Grace gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Mary Grace, honoring both Grant's lost sister and Grace herself. Mary was a sunny, easy baby, so different from Michael's colicky infancy that they wondered if they had somehow gotten someone else's child. Michael, now 3, was enchanted with his baby sister and appointed himself her protector, a role he took extremely seriously. Life was good, busy and full and rich with love. Grace's garden flourished, providing food for their family and the ranch. Daisy had been bred and now they had 2 cows, then 3, and Grace found herself with a small but profitable dairy business. Grant's work was demanding but fulfilling, and he was respected throughout the valley as a fair, capable man. The only shadow was the occasional violence that swept through the region. The tensions between cattlemen and miners, between settlers and the Native Americans being pushed off their lands, sometimes erupted in ways that reminded everyone the frontier was not yet tamed. But the running jay remained largely insulated from these troubles, and Grant was careful to keep his family safe. In 1885, Mr. Jennings called Grant into his office with a proposal that would change everything. "I am getting old," the ranch owner said bluntly. He was 70 now, his children back east with no interest in ranching. "I want to retire, move to San Francisco to be near my daughter. I am offering you the option to buy the running jay. I will sell it to you at a fair price, with terms that allow you to pay over time. You have earned it, Grant. This place runs smoothly because of you." Grant was stunned. He went home that night with the proposal papers, and he and Grace sat at their kitchen table, going over the numbers by lamplight while their children slept. "It is a lot of money," Grace said, but her eyes were bright with excitement. "But Grant, this is everything you have wanted, a ranch of your own, a legacy for our children." "Our children," Grant repeated, testing the words. "You think we can do this?" "I know we can," Grace said with the same certainty she had shown when she agreed to marry him. "We started with nothing but a spilled pail of milk, and look where we are now. If we can build this from that, we can do anything." The deal was finalized in the summer of 1885. Grant and Grace became the owners of the Running Jay Ranch, renaming it the Lawson Ranch. The responsibility was enormous, but they faced it together as they faced everything, and the ranch thrived under their ownership. They hired smart, treated their workers fairly, reinvested profits into improvements, and slowly, steadily, built something substantial. Grace's dairy business expanded, and she began selling cheese as well as butter and milk, supplying stores throughout the valley. Grant increased their herd, improved their grazing lands, and developed a reputation for raising quality cattle. Their family grew too. In 1887, Grace gave birth to twins, 2 boys they named Samuel and Jacob, and their house suddenly seemed much smaller. Grant added on 2 more bedrooms, and the sound of children's laughter filled the air constantly. Grace sometimes thought about the girl she had been, kneeling on that porch crying over spilled milk, certain her life was over. That girl would not recognize the woman she had become. Confident, capable, a successful businesswoman, a mother, a wife, a partner in every sense of the word. One evening in the autumn of 1890, after putting their children to bed, Grace and Grant sat on their porch as they so often did. 12 years had passed since that fateful day, and both of them carried the marks of those years in the silver threading through their hair, the lines around their eyes, the calluses on their hands. "You have any regrets?" Grace asked, the question prompted by a letter that had arrived that day from Thomas, inviting them to visit San Francisco. He had 3 children now, a successful business, and he wanted his family to finally meet his sister and her husband. "Regrets," Grant repeated, considering. I regret the years I lost with Mary. I regret not being there for my parents at the end, but meeting you, buying that cow, building this life, not for a single second. Not even when the twins broke your favorite saddle playing cowboys, Grace teased. Grant laughed. Not even then. What about you? Grace thought about the question seriously. She had lost so much, suffered so greatly, but it had all led her here to this porch with this man, surrounded by the life they had built together. I regret that my parents never got to meet you, she said. Never got to see their grandchildren, but everything else, even the hard parts, they brought me here. They brought me to you, so no regrets. They sat in comfortable silence, Grant's arm around Grace's shoulders, her head on his chest, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling for the night. We should go, Grace said suddenly. To San Francisco. The children are old enough now, and I want them to know their uncle, their cousins. Family is important. Then we will go, Grant agreed. But we come back here. This is home. Always, Grace promised. The trip to San Francisco in the spring of 1891 was an adventure. Michael, now 11, and Mary, 8, were old enough to be excited about the train journey and the big city. The twins, only 4, were exhausting but delighted by every new experience. Thomas met them at the train station, and when Grace saw her brother, now 32 and successful, looking in his city clothes, she felt the last remnants of old hurt dissolve. They embraced, both tearful, and then Thomas was shaking Grant's hand enthusiastically and exclaiming over the children. The visit was healing in ways Grace had not known she needed. She met Thomas's wife, a smart, kind woman named Ellen, and their 3 children who hit it off immediately with their California cousins. They talked late into the nights, Grace and Thomas piecing together the gaps in their shared history, finding forgiveness and understanding for the choices they had each made. On their last night in San Francisco, Thomas pulled Grant aside. I want to thank you, he said quietly, for taking care of my sister when I could not, for giving her the life she deserves. I have carried guilt for years about leaving her, but seeing her now, seeing how happy she is, it eases something in me. You do not owe me thanks, Grant said. Grace is not something I did for anyone else. She is the best thing that ever happened to me. I am the grateful one. Still, Thomas insisted. You are a good man, Grant Lawson. My sister chose well. The trip home felt different, as if something had been completed, a circle closed. Grace looked at her sleeping children on the train, at Grant dozing beside her with his hat pulled low, and felt a contentment so complete it was almost overwhelming. The years that followed were full of the ordinary miracles of life. The children grew, taking on responsibilities on the ranch, learning the business from their parents. Michael showed an aptitude for working with horses, while Mary had her mother's head for numbers and business. The twins were inseparable, always together, always scheming some adventure. Grace's dairy business became renowned throughout the region, her cheeses winning awards at state fairs. Grant's cattle were sought after, and the Lawson Ranch became one of the most respected operations in the Owning Valley. In 1895, on a warm June day, Grace and Grant celebrated their 16th wedding anniversary with a party at the ranch. Friends and neighbors came from miles around, including Mrs. Chen, now elderly but still spry, Klaus, who had retired but still loved to cook for celebrations, and dozens of others whose lives had been touched by the Lawson family's generosity and kindness. As Grace danced with Grant under the stars, their children laughing and playing with the other young people, she thought about the journey that had brought them here. A pail of spilled milk, a stranger's kindness, a cow named Daisy. Such small things to build a life on, and yet here they were, surrounded by abundance and love. "What are you thinking?" Grant asked, spinning her gently. "That I would spill 1,000 pails of milk if it meant ending up here with you with this life." Grant pulled her closer, not caring who saw. "I would ride past 1,000 crying women if I knew the last one would be you." "Liar," Grace said fondly. "You would help every single one, probably," he admitted with a grin, "but I would love only you." As the party wound down and they sent their exhausted children off to bed, Grace and Grant took one more walk around their ranch, hand in hand as they had done countless times over the years. The barn where Daisy had once lived now housed a dozen dairy cows. The small house where they had started now had 2 additional wings. The land that had been bare when they began was now dotted with outbuildings, corrals, and fields of crops and hay. Everywhere they looked was evidence of what they had built together. "You remember what you said?" Grace asked as they stood looking over their land. "That day you bought Daisy, you said you were offering me a solution to a problem. I remember. You were very suspicious of my motives." "I had a reason to be. Men did not just buy cows for strange women." Grace leaned against him. "But you did. You saw someone hurting and you helped, expecting nothing in return." "I got everything in return," Grant said. "I got you, I got this life. I got to be the man my father raised me to be." "You got to heal," Grace said softly. "From Mary, from your parents. You got to forgive yourself." "We both got to heal," Grant corrected. "That is what love does, is it not? It heals the broken places we try to hide." They stood in the darkness, 2 people who had found each other by accident or fate or providence, depending on what you believed, and built a life that exceeded anything they had imagined in their darkest moments. The years continued to turn. Michael married a rancher's daughter in 1898, and they built a house on the far edge of the Lawson property. Mary married a schoolteacher in 1900, and they moved to Los Angeles, where her husband had taken a position at a growing school. The twins both joined Michael in the ranching business, and it was clear the legacy Grant and Grace had built would continue into the next generation. In the spring of 1903, Grace discovered at 44 that she was pregnant again. Both she and Grant were shocked, having assumed their family was complete, but the surprise turned to joy and then to anticipation. This late baby, born in December of that year, was another daughter, and they named her Hope, because that was what she represented. The hope that had sustained them from the beginning, the hope that life could surprise you with gifts even when you thought you had everything. Michael and his wife had given them 2 grandchildren by then, and Mary was expecting her first. The house that had once been too small for their own children now filled regularly with grandchildren, and Grace and Grant found themselves in the unexpected role of doting grandparents. "We are getting old," Grace said one morning, finding a new strand of silver in her hair. "We are getting distinguished," Grant corrected, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. At 47, he was still strong and capable, though his joints ached more in the mornings and he was content to let Michael and the twins handle more of the physical ranch work. "Semantics," Grace said, but she was smiling. "Besides, you are more beautiful now than the day I met you," Grant said. "That girl on the porch, she was pretty but sad. You are radiant. You glow with happiness and confidence and the knowledge of being loved." "Flatterer," Grace accused, but she turned in his arms and kissed him. 24 years of marriage, and he could still make her heart flutter. The 20th century brought changes to the valley. Automobiles began to appear, roads improved, and the isolation that had defined frontier life began to diminish. The Lawson Ranch adapted, as it always had, adding modern conveniences while maintaining the core values that had built it. In 1910, Grant and Grace celebrated their 31st wedding anniversary with a family gathering. All four of their older children were there with their own families, and Hope, now 6, delighted in playing with her nieces and nephews. Thomas and his family had even made the trip from San Francisco. After the dinner, as the extended family talked and laughed, Thomas found Grace alone on the porch, standing in almost the exact spot where Grant had first seen her crying. "You ever think about how different things could have been?" Thomas asked, joining her. "Different how?" "If you had not dropped that milk, if that cowboy had not stopped, if any number of small things had gone differently." Thomas shook his head. "Your whole life turned on those moments." Grace considered this. "I suppose, but I think Grant and I would have found each other somehow." "Some things are meant to be." "You really believe that?" "I have to," Grace said. "Because the alternative is that it was all random chance, and that seems impossible. This life, this love, it is too perfect to be accidental." Inside, Grant was telling a story to the grandchildren, his voice animated, his face alive with joy. He must have felt Grace watching because he looked up, met her eyes through the window, and smiled. "He still looks at you like you hung the moon," Thomas observed. "The feeling is mutual," Grace said. "After all these years, he is still the man who saw me at my lowest and chose to help. That is not something you forget or take for granted." The evening wore on, and eventually the extended family departed, leaving just Grace, Grant, and young Hope in the quiet house. After putting their daughter to bed, they sat on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. "What are you thinking?" Grant asked, the question that had become a ritual between them. "I am thinking that if I could go back to that day, to that moment when the milk spilled, and tell that desperate, terrified girl what her life would become, she would never believe me." Grace took his hand. "She was so sure everything was over, that she had hit the bottom and there was no way up. And then you appeared." "Like an angel of mercy," Grant teased. "Like a stubborn cowboy who could not mind his own business," Grace corrected fondly. "The best kind of miracle, the practical kind. You did not fix everything with magic. You gave me the tools to fix it myself, and then you stayed to help me build something even better than what I had before." "We built it together," Grant reminded her. "You were never a charity case, Grace. You were always a partner. From that very first day when you insisted on a contract and paying me back, you were my equal." "I love you," Grace said simply. "I have loved you for 31 years, and I will love you for however many more we get." "Forever," Grant said. "We get forever. Maybe not in this life, but forever nonetheless." They sat in the darkness, two people who had started with nothing but each other and built an empire of love and legacy. The milk had spilled, the cowboy had bought a cow, and from that simple act of kindness had grown a life beyond measure. In the years that followed, Grant and Grace began to slow down. They handed over more of the ranch management to Michael and the twins, though they remained active in decision-making. Grace's dairy business was now run by a cooperative of women she had trained, her legacy extending beyond just her family. They spent more time with their grandchildren, passing on stories and wisdom, ensuring the family history would not be forgotten. In 1918, when Hope was 15, Grace found herself telling her youngest daughter the story of how she and Grant had met. They were sitting in the kitchen, making bread together, and Hope had asked about the old photograph on the wall, the one of a young, serious-faced Grace and a handsome Grant on their wedding day. "You know, we were very young when we married," Grace began. "I was only 19, your father 24. Scandalously fast by some people's standards, engaged after 3 months and married 3 months after that." "But you knew," Hope prompted. "You knew he was the one." "I knew he was kind. I knew he was good. The rest, the deep love, the partnership that grew over time, Love is not just a feeling, Hope. It is a choice you make every day to put someone else's needs alongside your own, to build a life together brick by brick. Grace paused in kneading the dough. When I met your father, I was at my absolute lowest. I had lost my parents, your uncle had left, and I was alone and scared. I dropped a pail of milk, and I thought it was the end of everything. And Papa bought you a cow, Hope said. She had heard pieces of this story before, but never the full version. He did. And that cow, Daisy, she saved my life. But more than that, your father's kindness saved my life. He saw me not as someone to pity, but as someone worth helping. He gave me the means to help myself, and then stood beside me while I did it. That is romantic, Hope sighed. It was practical, Grace corrected with a smile. But yes, it was also romantic. The most romantic thing anyone has ever done for me, because it was real. It was not flowers or poetry or grand gestures. It was a working cow and a fair contract and the respect to treat me as an equal. Is that what I should look for? Hope asked. Someone practical. Grace considered her youngest daughter, so bright and curious, standing on the edge of womanhood. Look for someone who sees you, really sees you, not who they want you to be or who they think you should be, but who you actually are. Look for someone who helps you stand up when you are down but never tries to carry you as if you cannot walk on your own. Look for kindness, Hope. All the other qualities, the looks, the charm, the money, they fade or change. But kindness, that is forever. That conversation stayed with Grace, and she shared it with Grant that evening. We did all right, did we not? Grant said, his voice reflective. He was 63 now, still strong but showing his age in the silver of his hair and the deeper lines of his face. As parents, as partners, we did all right. We did more than all right, Grace said. She was 59, her once dark hair now almost completely silver, her hands marked with age spots and the calluses of a lifetime of work. We built something real, Grant. Not just the ranch, not just the business, but a family that knows how to love and work and honor each other. That is your influence, Grant said. You taught them that. You showed them what strength looks like, what grace under pressure means. I showed them what you showed me, Grace corrected. How to get back up when you fall, how to accept help without shame, how to build something from nothing. They were sitting on their porch, as they had countless times over the decades, and Grace felt a deep sense of peace. Her life had not been easy, but it had been good. So very, very good. The early 1920s brought the modern world fully to the Owning Valley. Electricity reached the ranch in 1923, and Grace marveled at the electric lights that replaced her oil lamps. A telephone was installed in 1924, connecting them instantly to the wider world. These conveniences were wonderful, but Grace sometimes missed the simplicity of earlier days, when life moved slower and the world felt smaller. In the summer of 1925, Grant suffered a mild stroke. It was not severe, but it was a reminder that they were no longer young. He recovered most of his function, but his left side remained slightly weak, and he tired more easily. Grace insisted he retire fully from ranch work, and this time he agreed without argument. They spent that autumn together, more time than they had had since the early days of their marriage. They took drives in the automobile Michael had bought them, visited their scattered children and grandchildren, and spent long evenings on the porch talking about everything and nothing. You ever wish you had done things differently? Grace asked one evening, the question prompted by a letter from Mary, who was now living in Hollywood where her husband had become a principal of a prestigious school. Traveled more, seen more of the world. I have seen everything that matters, Grant said. He spoke more slowly now, the stroke having affected his speech slightly, but his mind was as sharp as ever. I have seen the seasons change on this land for nearly 50 years. I have seen my children born and grow and become better people than I ever was. I have seen the face of the woman I love every single day for 46 years. What could the world offer me that compares to that? Poetry, Grace said softly. After all these years, you have learned poetry. I had a good teacher, Grant said, reaching for her hand. Their 46th wedding anniversary in January of 1926 was quiet. Just the two of them, Hope, who had married and moved to Sacramento, visiting with her husband and infant son. It was perfect, intimate, a celebration of a love that had endured nearly half a century. That night, lying in bed, Grace curled against Grant's side as she had done for 46 years. "We made it," she whispered. "Made it where?" Grant asked. "Forever. You promised me forever, and here we are." "Still not done," Grant said. "We have more forever to go." And for many more years, they did. They welcomed more grandchildren, celebrated more anniversaries, watched the world change in ways they never could have imagined. The ranch continued to thrive under Michael's leadership. Grace's dairy business became a regional institution, and the name Lawson became synonymous with integrity and quality throughout California. On a warm spring morning in 1935, Grace sat on her porch, now 76 years old, her body marked with the years but her spirit still vibrant. Grant, 80, sat beside her, and they watched the sun rise over the land they had built together. "Tell me the story," Grant said suddenly. "What story?" "Our story, how we met. I want to hear you tell it." So Grace did. She told him about the milk spilling, about her despair, about the stranger on a gray horse who had stopped to help. She told him about Daisy and the contract and the first nervous delivery to the ranch. She told him about the harvest social and the first kiss in the barn and the life they had built from those humble beginnings. Grant listened with his eyes closed, a small smile on his face, and when she finished, he opened his eyes and looked at her. "That is the best story I have ever heard," he said. "It is our story," Grace said, "the only one that matters." "Do you know what the best part is?" Grant asked. "What?" "That it is still going. Every day we wake up together, it is another chapter. As long as we are here, the story continues." They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands, watching the world wake up around them. The ranch was busy with activity, the morning shift beginning, life continuing the cycle that had sustained them for so long. Grant Lawson lived to see his 82nd birthday, surrounded by his wife, children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. He died peacefully in his sleep on a summer night in 1937, Grace beside him as she had been for over 50 years. At his funeral, the entire valley turned out. He had been a pillar of the community, a man who had built not just a successful ranch but a legacy of fairness and kindness. But the eulogy that mattered most came from Grace, standing before the gathered crowd with her children behind her. "My husband was a simple man in the best possible way," she said, her voice still strong despite her tears. "He saw problems and solved them. He saw people hurting and helped them. He never asked for recognition or reward. He just lived his life with integrity and kindness. And in doing so, he changed everything for me and for countless others." She paused, looking at the photograph of Grant displayed at the front of the church, so young and handsome in his wedding suit. 58 years ago, I dropped a pail of milk. I sat on my porch and cried, certain my life was over. And then this man, this wonderful, stubborn, kind man, rode into my life and bought me a cow. Such a simple thing, such an ordinary gesture of kindness. But from that moment, everything changed. He gave me the tools to save myself, and then spent the rest of his life standing beside me as I did it. He was my partner, my best friend, my love, and my home. And though he is gone from this world, He is not gone from me. He will never be gone from me. He lives in our children, in our grandchildren, in this ranch we built, in every person he helped throughout his life. That is his legacy. That is his forever. Grace lived another 10 years without Grant. Years filled with her family and her work, and the knowledge that she had been blessed beyond measure. She watched her grandchildren have children of their own, saw the ranch continue to thrive into the third generation, and knew that what she and Grant had built would outlast them both. On a spring morning in 1947, Grace woke early, as she had done for her entire life. She was 88 now, frail but still mentally sharp. She dressed carefully and made her way to the porch, to the spot where so many years ago she had dropped that fateful pail of milk. The valley had changed so much since those days. Roads were paved now. Electricity and telephones were everywhere. Automobiles had replaced horses for most purposes. But the land itself remained, enduring and beautiful, and the ranch that she and Grant had built still stood strong. She thought about her life, about the journey from that desperate girl to this contented old woman. She thought about Grant, gone but never far from her thoughts, and smiled. "I am coming," she whispered to the morning air. "Forever, you promised. I am holding you to that." Grace Patterson Lawson died peacefully that afternoon, surrounded by her children, her hand clutched in Michael's, her eyes on the land she had loved for nearly 7 decades. At her funeral, held in the same church where Grant's had been, Hope stood to deliver the eulogy her mother had requested. "My mother's life began the day she dropped a pail of milk," Hope said, reading from the letter Grace had written. "Everything before that was just preparation. She told me once that the worst moment of her life led directly to the best, that sometimes we have to break completely before we can be remade into something stronger. She and my father built this ranch, built this family, built this legacy from nothing but a cow and a contract and love. So much love. That is what I want you to remember. Not the success, not the ranch, not the business, but the love. Love that saw beyond despair to possibility. Love that chose partnership over pride. Love that lasted from youth to old age without wavering. That is what they gave us. That is what they were, and that is what they would want their story to mean." The family buried Grace beside Grant on a hill overlooking the ranch, where they could watch over the land they had built together. On the shared headstone, Michael had inscribed, "Grant and Grace Lawson." He bought her a cow. She gave him forever. The Lawson Ranch continued for generations, each one adding to the legacy but never forgetting the foundation. The story of how it all began, of the spilled milk, and the kind cowboy and the cow named Daisy, became family legend, told and retold to each new generation. And somewhere, in whatever forever looks like, Grant and Grace Lawson sat together, hands entwined, watching over the family they had created and the love story that had started with a simple act of kindness and became something that would last long after they were gone. The milk had spilled. The cowboy had bought a cow. And from that moment, everything had changed, proving that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are just the beginning of our greatest blessings, and that true love, built on kindness and respect and partnership, really can last forever.